Well, probably a quiz on Tuesday. No, not going to happen. So the quiz on Thursday now. So that should make life easier for you as you start studying on Monday, right? Not wait until Wednesday morning. And we still got a lot to cover about the illustrious Ike, President Dwight David Eisenhower. Remember, this is going to be just over Truman and Eisenhower. So I'll start right about here. Whoops. You're on the air. Okay. By the way, another thing before we start. Bella, you're not going to believe this, but there's only 7 more of these right here that we will meet like this. 7 more on Monday. That sounds crazy because there's like a whole quarter to go, and there's 10 Mondays till you get to the end of the school year. But Memorial Day, we will not be here together. Easter Monday, we will not be here together. And mini term Monday, we will not be here together. So there's only 7 more times that we meet like this on a moon day. Okay. Eisenhower's first term. Stop me when we got to where you guys are in your notes. You did Brown versus Board of Education? You saw the video? You didn't see the video. Idea, ladies and gentlemen, but this idea that in the beacon of liberty to all the world, which is still true, even in the listen. This is what you're going to face as you go to higher education and you meet up with 180-degree different things that you're being taught. That you can at once have the greatest government ever devised by man based on the Declaration of Independence and how it melds so greatly with the U.S. Constitution. And even though the country was started with certain things that today we find very reprehensible, I hope you do, and very detestable, that compared to world history, the environment that country was before the country that you're now living in, it was the documents that formed that country that even though it took a long time, forged the path to the end of slavery. Forged the path, though it took so long for some people in the country to get it through their heads, because here we are 90 years after the end of the Civil War, and as we showed you in the election of 1952, even with a guy like Eisenhower, who was loved by all people because of his war hero status, the people in the South just couldn't give it up. He didn't win those states because they couldn't give up the idea that they were, they just weren't going to give in and treat black people as equals. 2 generations later, we're into the 3rd generation. We're going to finally get it right, although when I say get it right, we legally get it right. And some would say that we might be in a post-race society if not for some people make a lot of money by continuing it. Anybody know who Morgan Freeman is? I mean, you guys are younger, but he's a very popular actor for all generations. Like your grandparents probably know him and love him, and parents. And there's a black man. Guess what he says? You know when racism finally ends? When people stop talking about it. Washington, many very popular people, unfortunately, we have to say that they're black people that are, listen, all this stuff is happening is being drummed up by people who are called race hustlers. It's how they make their money. That's how they make their living, by keeping going. Now, of course, you're never going to have a perfect society, right? There's slavery places in the world still. There's still going to be hate in a fallen world. But overall, About the time I was born, legally, we had this thing beaten. We finally got to the point, you'll see in the next week or so, where the United States finally got it right. And the South came kicking and screaming and had to come into compliance legally with the idea that superior to blacks. And we got to the point where we were legally. Unfortunately, we still got to work on, we still have to work on a lot of people's hearts, right? Anybody, by the way they talk? I can't be the only raising my hand. You have grandparents. I have parents and aunts and uncles. There are people that I hope you don't have that situation because you're surrounded by. By the way, people used to use Christianity as a way of saying that it's okay to be racist. Anyway, but unfortunately, we haven't won all their hearts, but legally. So you didn't see the video. The said, you know what? This is ridiculous. Unanimously voted that what was happening in these states that were trying to say that they can mandate segregation, that they can say that you can have a separate school for blacks and whites, and say that you can do that because even though they're separate, they're still equal. Well, were they equal? No, they weren't equal. In fact, everybody knows they weren't equal. But you can just keep saying they were. Oh, yeah, we're funding them. Right. Oh, yeah, they have state certified teachers. Okay. But were they really? Oh, yeah, they might have had a certificate. But were they the best teachers? Did the best teachers go to teach in these black schools? Oh, you were funding them and maintaining them, but did those schools look the same as the white schools? No. Supreme Court finally got it right.
If she's only protected from heartworm disease, her coverage is coming up short. Upgrade to Interceptor Plus. It protects from not only heartworm, but all 5 major worms, keeping her fully covered. Test dogs for heartworm.
What is this?
Shocking. You look great. You're in good health.
Took a lot of straight.
Somebody hit that light back there. Okay. Can I have your attention, please?
Yes, sir.
May I have your attention, please?
In a cold breeze.
Haha, funny.
Topeka, Kansas, 1950. Schools were segregated by skin color. Each day, 8-year-old Linda Brown and her sister had to walk 1 mile, crossing several busy railroad tracks along the way to get to a bus that led them to a school across town. Now, an elementary school already existed just 4 blocks from their home, but this school was for white children only, and Linda Brown and her sister were African American. Linda's father, Oliver Brown, tried to enroll her in the white-only elementary school, but the principal of the school wouldn't allow it. So Brown went to the Topeka's branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, and asked for help. The NAACP had actually already been planning on challenging segregation in public schools. The organization helped 12 other African-American parents attempt to enroll their children in whites-only schools in the Topeka School District. A major goal of the NAACP was to bring down the precedent set up by Plessy v. Ferguson, the 1896 Supreme Court decision that said segregated facilities based on skin color was okay as long as both facilities were the same quality. This became known as the, quote, separate but equal doctrine. The NAACP helped Brown and the rest of the parents sue the Board of Education of the city of Topeka after the district continued to refuse to let their children enroll in whites-only schools. The parents claimed their children's rights, as protected by the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, were being violated. The NAACP put Oliver Brown at the head of the roster as a legal strategy. The Board of Education argued that segregation was already a way of life, And segregated schools simply got them ready for the segregation they would later encounter as adults. They also claimed that segregated schools were not harmful to Black children. The United States District Court for the District of Kansas heard the case and ruled in favor of the Board of Education, using the ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson.
Are you paying attention? Did you catch that part? Why was the state arguing that it was okay? And were they saying to prepare them for the future because were they saying that they were preparing for a future that Blacks were inferior? No. What were they saying? Because what they're arguing against is the mandated, right? This young girl and many others, all she had to do to walk to this place, get to a bus, take a mile when there was a school down the street, all that she had to do to get to school, that was mandated by the Board of Education in that town and even by the state, right? So that was a legal issue. But what the state was saying was, well, there is such thing as segregation. It's just a fact. Have I written this phrase on the board before? Have I written that in this class before? De facto. Just a matter of fact. There's another term, de jure, that means by law. Get it? Judge, jury. So by law, they were mandated to send them to another school because of segregation. It was a legal issue, right? Well, then they argue in court, well, it's only like that because society is segregated in fact. Question, is it? Do we self-segregate ourselves? Think. We do, don't we? See, they argued that segregation is like a way of life. When they said a way of life, they were saying segregation is a way of life. We tend to, whatever the law is, we tend to run with our own. Do you ever look at, probably haven't done a study of it, but you notice that even outside black and white, cities as they grew in America, you would have certain section of a city that were mostly Italian. Did you know that? Or you would have certain sections of cities there was no law. They were all quote unquote white Caucasian people, European people, but they would all form their own little neighborhoods. You understand what I'm saying? And that was the argument that the state was making, the state board, like, hey, segregation is like a fact, it's a way of life. People that's what they do. So we're just preparing them. Come on. It seems like a good argument, but really you're just trying to legalize the idea that you think blacks are inferior. Right? But by saying that, they thought they were kind of winning some common sense argument that people do, in fact, segregate from one another. Right? Some of you do it at your big family reunions. You go to this big family reunion, all you hang out with people you already know anyways. Anybody ever do that? Right? You're like, there's all these different cousins and all these different people, branches of your family, and you all go and you sit at the table with the people you're always with anyway. It's kind of weird. What's that?
Because all the other people know your name and you don't know them, and it gets really
The
awkward.
point to the family reunion, though, is to get to know your
You're not going
extended
to see
family.
them for a year or so.
Right, so you get to know them. That's the point
Then
to
you
it.
forget.
But anyway, don't we do that though? We self-segregate. Not a good rationale for having laws that are really, you're using that to hide that you want to keep people down.
As their justification. And yet, the 3-judge district court panel argued that segregation hurts African American children. Still, they insisted that whites only and blacks only schools in Topeka were of equal quality in terms of facilities, the qualifications of teachers, transportation, and what they were taught. Brown and the rest of the parents appealed to the Supreme Court. As it turns out, there were parents across the entire country fighting fiercely against school segregation in public schools as well. In 1952, the court considered 5 different cases that all dealt with the issue. Ultimately, the court just combined all 5 cases under the name of Brown v. Board of Education. The NAACP had been involved in all 5 cases and appointed Thurgood Marshall, a future Supreme Court justice, to argue the case for Brown. The court remained divided on the issue, and they knew this was a big freaking deal, so they didn't want to rush it.
Hold on. Why would the United States Supreme Court, even if they all thought it was wrong, why would they be divided on this issue? See how much you've been paying attention to American history, American heritage, our constitutional republic, the way our government is set up. There's a big billboard and a big sign in the front of the room that's there every day. Why would the U.S. Supreme Court, even if all the justices thought intellectually and morally that it was wrong, why were they still divided on making a judgment on this case, Noel?
Because they thought it was more of a situation for the state government.
Right. Does the federal government have the authority in the United States Constitution to just unilaterally say, hey, this is the way it's got to be? That's a big question. Shouldn't the state of Kansas control the education in the state of Kansas? This is almost the end of March. We were supposed to be getting a ruling here pretty soon on life. So the Supreme Court in 1973, when they said, we're going to make a national decision about killing babies in their mother's womb. What's the argument against that? Even no matter where you stand on the morality of it, that's a state's issue. What's the federal government thinking that they can go tell the state of Ohio what is going to be the law when it concerns to unborn children? But they did it in 1973 for that issue. It's a hard, that's, you could be totally against something intellectually, but your job is to adjudicate the law.
Chief Justice Fred Vinson was really worried about a close vote that would dramatically change the country, and he, in particular, wanted to postpone the decision. Well, he died in September, and President Dwight D. Eisenhower nominated Earl Warren, the former governor of California, as Vinson's replacement. The court reheard the case in December 1953, with Warren now. For several months, the justices debated and discussed the case. One justice who had thought about voting against Brown, Robert H. Jackson, suffered a mild heart attack during this time. Warren went to visit him in the hospital, continuing to discuss the case during his recovery. Ultimately, Jackson would change his mind. Warren was able to do what Vinson was not. He brought all the justices together for a unanimous decision. That's right, on May 17, 1954, the court voted 9-0 in support of Brown. This overturned the now infamous Plessy v. Ferguson decision, saying that segregation of schools based on skin color went against the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The court also argued that segregated schools made African American children feel inferior and damaged their development. Warren gave the opinion of the court, saying, quote, "We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal," unquote. Reporters at the announcement of the decision were shocked that it was unanimous. They expected a divided court. They were also shocked to see Robert Jackson there. Jackson had actually left the hospital directly to go there. He wanted to be there to show the court was truly united behind the decision. Now, the court did not announce how the ruling was to be enforced. Instead, it asked the attorney generals of all states enforcing segregation laws for their feedback. The court heard a bunch of more hearings over the next year, and on May 31st, 1955, announced a plan for how to proceed with the desegregation of public schools. They said it should occur with, quote, "all deliberate speed," whatever that means.
So they've passed the law, or they've struck down the separate but equal. that it is not constitutional to have segregated schools. So, hey, states, get your act together with all deliberate speed. So that was 1955, right? So what does all deliberate speed mean? To the people of Mississippi, might mean we'll get around to it as soon as we can. Right? So, moving on. Questions, comments? Surprises? What about continuing with Ike? I like Ike. Still in his first term. Anybody ever heard of Dien Bien Phu?
Oh, yeah.
That's Cap. Dien Bien Phu. You never heard of it, I know. Why would you, right? Well, back way before what we consider the Vietnam War, things started brewing in that region, Southeast Asia, because in a city called Dien Bien Phu, a little battle took place between the locals there and the French authorities. You know that the world was once separated by imperialist countries in Europe that had kind of like gone into places like Asia and Africa, and they laid claims to parts of those places. That's how we have such thing as a British Empire, right? Well, there was a French Empire as well. It's not as well known. It wasn't as powerful, but the French had control of this area right there. My shaky hand. You see that right there? South. Come on, let's go. Southeast Asia. That's where Vietnam is. And the French lose control of this area, and Vietnam gets split into North and South. The Geneva Conference in 1954. By the way, where's Geneva? What country? Who remembers? Geneva is in Central Europe, in a country that historically is neutral, Switzerland, right? They don't want to be involved in all of these conflicts that are going on all around them. We are a place, a place for neutrality. In fact, even economically, not just war, but there's something called, if you want to hide or if you want to protect your money, you might put it in a blank bank account. Swiss bank account. You never heard that before? Because Switzerland, known for their neutrality and not allowing other countries to interfere with what they're doing, they don't interfere with what other countries are doing. So a lot of people, they set up quote unquote Swiss bank accounts, and that takes their money away from other countries that might, tax it at higher rates, so that it's kind of off limits, because Switzerland will not allow other countries to just easily go in there and say, hey, can we see their bank account? Switzerland's like, no. It just come in. Does that make sense? Because of their neutrality. So they meet at Geneva, and the world leaders want to talk about what's going on in a place called Indochina. India and China in the southeast. So here we have, again, that's right here in context on the map. That's Southeast Asia. This is where Vietnam is, right there on the coast. So that's this. So out of this conference, France loses control of this whole area. Just to the west of that area, across the Bay of Bengal, is India. And of course, there's China. So it makes sense. This was called Indochina. And now it gets separated. Instead of being French territory, now you've got North, South Vietnam. You got a country called Laos, and you got a country called Cambodia and Thailand. You heard of Thailand before? You ever eat Thai food? You like Thai food? Anybody have Thai food? Yeah. Questions, comments? Now you have an idea where that place you've heard of before, Vietnam, and you got a basic idea of way before the war starts. How did that war come to be? Well, France was forced out of that area. Who's going to be in charge now? What happens in history when one person or one entity who was in charge is no longer in charge? What's that called? A power? Starts with a V. Somebody say it? It creates a power vacuum. Someone's going to be in charge, right? Throughout history, think about it. One king dies, another king has to take their place. Who's going to take their place? There's a battle for who's going to be in power. Who's going to take control of these areas? Well, we're in the middle of a Cold War. Russia and China, communist sympathy, they're going to take control of the north part of Vietnam. It's just like Korea. And we're going to come in and help the people of the South Vietnam hold off those commies. Is it okay to call them commies? It's not a race. Yes, it's perfectly fine. Hey, you should feel free to intellectually denigrate socialism and communism all you want. You ever heard of the lady that refused to give up her seat on the bus?
Rosa Parks.
Rosa Parks. That's also going to take place here in the middle of the 1950s. Rosa Parks, who was already like, you know what, this stuff is so ridiculous, it's got to end. So one day she decided, this is the day, December 1st, 1955. This is the day I'm going to make this stand. I'm going to sit down here in this seat. I got on the bus, and when I got on the bus, started down the aisle, and there was a seat. So I took it. Why wouldn't I? It's off a long day's work. Well, the bus goes to the next stop and the next stop. More people are getting on the bus. And guy come down the aisle and seats are taken. There's some seats in the back. I guess what's this black lady doing sitting there? The audacity. Doesn't she know her place? Right? Didn't Cassie know her place when she bumped into Lily and Jean? Anybody remember that? Vaguely. Little thunder. She bumped. You say, excuse me. Remember the movie at least? No? Don't you know your place? Get in the back of the bus. Don't cause a scene. Just get up and get in the back of the bus like you always do. And she refused. So she got arrested. And that begins what's called the Montgomery bus boycott. Okay, the black people all got together and they said, you know what? Let's go ahead and have this battle. We're going to finally have this battle. I'll walk 6 miles to work. I'm not taking the bus. So Montgomery, all the cities at this time, you know, public transportation was a big thing, especially for blacks. Because, as you might imagine, less percentage of black people owned automobiles. Make sense? So they rely on public transportation. Well, guess what? Public transportation then relies on them using public transportation. So if all the black people decide, you know what, we're not going to ride your bus, that's going to be a big hit, right? To the city or county that's running the public transportation, because they're going to lose a lot of money. So they boycott. I know you've heard about Rosa Parks many times, so I found a nice short one that suffices in explaining it.
December 1st, 1955. On that day, Rosa Parks boarded a bus and took a seat. A few stops later, she was told to her seat to a white passenger who had just boarded. She refused. For those who insist that a moment be pinpointed when the American Revolution of '66 began, that moment will serve.
When Rosa Parks decided to stay seated in 1955, I was 2.5 years old. I know that what Rosa Parks did made a huge difference in my life. The conventional wisdom about her was, oh, this was just a woman who got on the bus, she was tired, her feet hurt, she didn't want to get up. But that does not take into account her incredibly amazing political consciousness.
She was part of a community of women activists at local colleges who were organizing to take on segregated buses.
Rosa Parks sat down on the bus and began what we know today as American Civil Rights Movement.
Rosa Parks actually galvanized a people for change. Rosa Parks had the discipline and the consciousness and the awareness to be able
Who's that guy
to
speaking?
represent African Americans who are trying to make a difference.
And when Rosa Parks makes her stand, she became an icon for change.
And something that started with a spark for this woman, that grew into a local bus boycott, that grew into a national consciousness. It made most Americans.
Bus was empty and they're all walking to work.
And justice realized that this way of life had to end.
Questions, comments on that? So what that's going to do, that's the spark, right? That's a spark that leads to, over the next decade, America finally getting it together. Remember, television is now in more and more people's homes. People living in the North, St. Ohio, where we were much more integrated by then, not so segregated. We'd see this on the news. We're like, really? They're really still living like that in Mississippi or Alabama? So more and more people from the North got to see it firsthand. Maybe they'd never seen it before. So people from the North started going down, joining these marches and these protests. And then you get the rise of Martin Luther King Jr. That's like, hey, we got to do this very peacefully. What we're going to do is, because of television, that helped him a lot, helped them a lot, that what people are going to see in the North, in New York and in Cleveland and in Chicago, is us marching arm in arm peacefully. And we're going to see how the city leaders treat us. And we can do this peacefully. We're going to revolutionize the way people think, because we're not going to fight back. As soon as you do, just like, who was the guy, 1947, Brooklyn Dodgers? Jackie Robinson. They had to have a guy that wouldn't fight back, because as soon as he did, as soon as they started yelling the N-word at him, as soon as they started insulting his mother, as soon as they threatened to kill him, if he was to fight, as soon as they started spiking him on purpose, if he was to fight back, what would all the white people say that were against it already? See how they act? So Martin Luther King got them to just peacefully, if they bring out the fire hose, just keep marching peacefully. And the people of the country will see that here we are peaceful. And it worked. So, of course, the people that couldn't let go of their hate killed them. No questions, comments? Oops. So many things to fumble around. The Warsaw Pact happens in 1955. I know. This isn't as exciting as learning about Rosa Parks. But the Warsaw Pact is a very important thing. You know about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that was formed after World War II, and the Western European countries and the United States had this alliance that they were going to make sure nothing like Germany happens again, that no person like Hitler is going to be able to rise up without us paying attention early on and putting that to a stop. Well, Russia decides, hey, okay, we'll have our own little pact too. All the Eastern European countries are going to be brought together and have our own alliance, and then meet in Warsaw, which is Poland. Warsaw, Poland, just west of Ukraine. It's the country you're hearing about in the news, where most of the people that have fled Ukraine are now finding refuge in Poland, because it was once one of those countries that the Soviet Union took over after World War II. So the Warsaw Pact was the Soviet Union's answer to NATO. They had organized all of the Eastern Bloc, BLOC. So now the Cold War is really taking on new meaning. It's literally East versus West, as Rocky Drago. You probably heard of polio. I know you heard of polio because you know that one of our former presidents had polio. Who was it? FDR. And he dealt with that for a long time. Polio was the public enemy number one as far as infectious disease in the first part of the 20th century, 1900s. And finally, we developed a vaccine for that. And there's so much more I would like to talk about because I've read a lot about whether the vaccine was as effective as they say it was or things were happening, but we won't get into that. Here's what you need to know. Jonas Salk is the scientist that came up with the inactivated type. What do you mean inactivated type? What do you think that means? Jonas Salk came up with the idea that you can inject the inactivated type of vaccine rather than what was happening before this was they would give a liquid that contained not inactivated but activated, meaning
It would give you the
living, yes, the living virus, as opposed to what most vaccines are, is you are being injected with a dead, inactivated virus, but your body then still recognizes that pathogen and says, oh, and it's dead, but it still recognizes it, right? So then when it does come in real form to hurt your body has built immunity to it. That's the whole idea behind vaccines, right? So that he could come up with that less dangerous, right? Because, okay, you try to control, we're going to give them the live virus, but in such small quantities that their body's going to be able to overcome it. Well, if it's live, more chance their body might not be able to overcome it than if it's inactive. So that was Jonas Salk. That's a big deal because it's going to lead to many more vaccines in the latter half of the 20th century, right? Not to be confused with what we're calling a vaccine the last year and a half, right? Because vaccines are meant to keep the disease from getting it and spreading it, right? See what I'm saying? At least, right? And we know that what they're calling a vaccine for the COVID-19 isn't actually a vaccine because what were we changing the definition of that too? Right? It's a gene therapy. It's meant to recognize your body to recognize it and hopefully fight it off better. But to call it a vaccine is kind of a stretch. But it's the language that we all understand, so they continue to use it. I'm going to give them credit for using it for that reason. And then we got the interstate highway system that we all enjoy. This incredible web of roads, almost 50,000 miles of interconnected highways, north and south, east and west, that allow us to go just about anywhere in the country in a pretty efficient manner. By the way, who's the president at this time? Eisenhower, right? What's he famous for? Come on. He's a general. He led D-Day, right? He was the commander of all the Allied forces. This guy knows how to run things. And part of the reason for building the interstate highway system wasn't necessarily just to make it more convenient for people to travel. It makes it easier for the military to get from place to place. Hello? We've got all these bases. What if somebody's ever to invade America?
Good job.
We'd be able to connect, right?
Is our scrimmage home or what?
At McDonald's.
Can't remember if that feels nice.
I haven't been there in a minute. Old MacDonald had fun. E-I-E-I-O.
They passed their law like right up to the last second. And they also have a law that says first degree is like you cannot investigate or prosecute Stay for 28 days, you could kill your babies.
What do you do?
We talked about it yesterday.
It's sick. Yeah, so it's beyond even.
That's fine.
putting on the law, but you have to try to save it.
Really, you're so good. Yeah, it's like all this stuff. And then there's
Bye.
I got a nice little board over there.
That's for all Friday.
Take your weird bendy thing.
I was like, that whole one.
Hi, Jordan.
Mr. Franken, would you like these bendy thingies?
No, I like you in your seat. How about you bend yourself into that seat over there?
It's like Mr. Franken.
Excuse you?